You will not be elevated until the universe removes people. The silence that felt like punishment. You did not see it coming. That is the part that stays with you. Not just the loss itself, but the way it arrived without warning, without a proper goodbye, without enough time to prepare your heart for the weight of what was about to change. One day the people were there. The conversations, the familiar voices, the comfort of knowing someone would answer when you called. And then, slowly or all at once, they were not. And the silence they left behind was so loud it almost broke you. You told yourself you must have done something wrong. You replayed the moments, the words, the choices, looking for the crack, the mistake, the version of events where you could have held it all together. You wondered if you were too much, or not enough. You wondered if there was something fundamentally flawed inside you that made people leave, that made connection a temporary thing, that made you someone people eventually grow tired of carrying. You questioned your worth in the quiet of 3 a.m. when there was no one to call, and the darkness felt like evidence of everything you feared about yourself. But what if the silence was not punishment? What if it was preparation? There is a force at work in your life that does not explain itself. It does not send you a message before it acts. It does not ask for your permission or your comfort or your readiness. It simply moves. And the way it moves is by removing, by clearing, by taking from your hands the very things you were gripping the tightest, the things you had convinced yourself you could not survive without, and creating in their absence a space so wide and so empty that you have no choice but to finally look at yourself. The universe does not remove people from your life because you failed. It removes them because you are about to rise. And what is rising cannot carry what no longer belongs to the version of you that is being built. This is not a comforting metaphor. This is the actual uncomfortable sacred mechanics of how human transformation works. And by the time you reach the end of this, you will understand not just why people left, but why they had to. Why the pain you are carrying right now is not the sign of something going wrong. It is the sign of something going right, in the most profound and disorienting way possible. You were never abandoned. You were being chosen. And the story of how that happened begins right now. Not every presence was a gift. There is a belief most people carry without ever examining it, and it goes something like this. If someone is in my life, they belong there. If I love them, it must mean the connection is right. If it hurts to lose them, it must mean losing them was a mistake. This belief feels true. It feels true because it is built on real emotion, on real memory, on the genuine warmth of having been close to someone. But feeling true and being true are two entirely different things. And one of the most quietly devastating things that can happen to a person is spending years holding on to a connection that was slowly, invisibly, pulling them underwater. Not every presence in your life was a gift. Some were lessons wrapped in the appearance of love. Some were mirrors showing you your own unhealed wounds, dressed up as relationships that felt like home. Some were comfortable in the way that a small room is comfortable, familiar and enclosed, and you stayed not because it was nourishing, but because it was known. Because the unknown felt far more dangerous than the invisible cost of staying. The truth is that human beings are extraordinarily skilled at adapting to environments that are slowly diminishing them. You can spend years in a friendship, a relationship, a social circle, and never once stop to ask whether the connection is actually lifting you, or whether you have simply grown accustomed to the weight of it. The warmth of familiarity is one of the most powerful sedatives that exists. It quiets the part of you that knows something is off. It makes you negotiate with your own instincts. It makes you tell yourself that what you have is enough, even when some deeper part of you is quietly starving. Most people do not realize that belonging and familiarity are not the same thing. Belonging is the feeling of being fully seen, accepted, and valued for exactly who you are. Familiarity is simply the feeling of knowing someone well enough to predict them. You can know someone for 20 years and still never once feel truly seen by them. You can share a decade of memories with someone and still feel a low, persistent ache in their presence, an ache you have learned to ignore because addressing it would mean risking everything you built with them. Think about the relationships in your past, not just the ones that ended dramatically, but the quiet ones, the ones that faded, the ones where, if you are honest with yourself, You often felt more exhausted after spending time together than before. The ones where you consistently made yourself smaller, edited your thoughts, softened your truth, performed a version of yourself that was acceptable to them rather than authentic to you. The ones where the dynamic was so familiar that you called it comfort, when what it actually was containment. There is a reason why the removal of certain people does not only bring grief, it also brings beneath the grief, in the quiet spaces between the pain, a feeling you are almost ashamed to acknowledge. Relief. A kind of soft, guilty exhale, as if something that had been pressing on your chest for a long time has finally lifted. That relief is not a sign that the relationship meant nothing. It is a sign that the relationship cost more than you were willing to admit while it was happening. It is your nervous system telling the truth that your heart was not ready to speak. Not every presence was a gift. And recognizing this is not about blame. It is not about deciding that certain people were bad or wrong or unworthy of your love. It is about being honest about what certain connections were actually doing to the version of you that was trying to grow. Because the truth is, you cannot rise in the presence of people who are deeply committed to staying where they are, not because they are bad people, but because the gravity of a fixed identity is one of the most powerful forces in existence. And if you stay close enough, long enough, you will feel it pulling you back down every time you begin to lift. The people who left were not all losses. Some of them were releases. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a life spent grieving and a life spent growing. The weight you were carrying without knowing. Before the removal happened, before the people began to leave or fade or disappear, there was something you were doing every single day that you were completely unaware of. You were working. Quietly, invisibly, exhaustingly working to maintain something that should never have required that much effort to sustain. You were managing, you were adjusting, you were reading rooms, softening edges, shrinking yourself into shapes that fit the expectations of people who had never once asked whether you were comfortable in the space they left for you. This is what no one talks about when they talk about relationships and social circles and the people in our lives. They talk about love and loyalty and connection. They talk about the beautiful things, but they rarely talk about the invisible labor of being someone who feels everything deeply, trying to belong in spaces where depth is not welcome. The labor of being thoughtful in rooms full of people who have never once examined a single belief they hold. The labor of being sensitive in a world that rewards performance. The labor of being real in relationships built on the comfortable exchange of surfaces. Most people do not realize how much energy is consumed by the performance of belonging. Every time you swallowed a thought because you were afraid of how it would land, every time you laughed at something that did not feel funny to avoid the discomfort of honesty, every time you stayed quiet in a conversation that was moving in a direction that felt wrong to you, not because you had nothing to say, but because the cost of saying it felt too high. Every single one of those moments cost you something. Not dramatically, not in a way that felt significant in isolation, but cumulatively, over months and years the cost became staggering. There is a psychological phenomenon that researchers call emotional labor, and while it is often discussed in the context of caregiving or professional settings, it is just as present and just as depleting in personal relationships. When you spend significant energy managing your emotional expression to meet the needs or expectations of others, you are performing emotional labor. And when that labor is chronic, when it is the invisible price of admission to every relationship in your life, it does not just exhaust you, it disconnects you from your own feelings, from your own instincts, from the clearest, most honest version of who you actually are. You may not have noticed it while it was happening. That is the insidious nature of gradual erosion. You do not feel yourself becoming smaller, you simply adapt. You find new ways to be comfortable in increasingly uncomfortable spaces. You develop a kind of internal split, the part of you that is present in the room, laughing and engaging and performing belonging, and the part of you that is somewhere else entirely, watching, waiting, quietly exhausted by the distance between what you are showing and what you are actually feeling. And here is what that weight was doing to you beneath the surface. It was blocking. Every ounce of energy spent managing, suppressing, performing, and adjusting was energy that could not be used for anything else, for creating, for thinking clearly, for hearing your own instincts, for building something that actually mattered to you. The relationships that drained you were not just costing you emotionally, they were costing you directionally. They were keeping you so occupied with the work of fitting in that you had almost no capacity left to figure out where you actually wanted to go. When the people left, when the circle thinned, when the noise decreased, you may have called it loneliness. But beneath the loneliness, something else was quietly beginning to happen. You were starting to get your energy back. Not all at once, not without grief, but slowly. Like a body recovering from a long illness, you were beginning to have access to parts of yourself that had been offline for years. Thoughts were clearer. Instincts were louder. The sense of who you were and what you actually wanted began to surface from somewhere deep beneath the accumulated weight of all that performance. That is not a coincidence. That is the first sign of what removal actually does to a person who was carrying more than they knew. The weight you were holding was not just emotional, it was existential. It was the weight of an identity built for someone else's comfort, rather than your own becoming. And when the people who required that identity began to disappear, you were left with something you had not felt in a very long time. The strange, disorienting, terrifying freedom of being exactly who you are, with no one left to perform for. Why the universe removes before it elevates. In nature, there is a process that gardeners and farmers understand deeply, even if they find it counterintuitive at first. It is called pruning. The deliberate removal of branches, growth, and sometimes entire sections of a plant, not because those parts are diseased or worthless, but because their presence is redirecting the plant's energy away from its highest potential. A rose bush that is never pruned will grow. It will produce leaves and branches and perhaps a few flowers, but a rose bush that is pruned with precision and intention will produce blooms of a size and beauty that the unpruned version could never achieve. The removal is not destruction, it is direction. What happens in your garden is a direct reflection of what happens in your life. And the force that governs both is not random. It is not cruel. It is not indifferent to your pain. It is simply committed to your growth at a level that your conscious mind has not yet caught up with. The universe, or whatever name you give to the intelligence that moves beneath the surface of your life, does not remove people because it wants to hurt you. It removes them because it has seen what you are capable of becoming. And it knows, with a clarity you do not yet have access to, that the person you are becoming cannot coexist with certain presences in their current form. Not because those people are evil or worthless or undeserving of your love, but because their continued presence in your life is directing your energy, your attention, your time, and your identity in a direction that leads away from the version of you that is being called forward. Think about this carefully. Elevation is not just about rising in circumstance. It is not about money or success or external recognition. True elevation is about becoming more fully yourself. It is about the gradual, sometimes painful, always profound process of shedding every version of yourself that was built for other people and growing into the version that was built for your actual purpose. And that process requires, without exception, the removal of everything that is incompatible with who you are becoming. Some people in your life were attached not to you, but to a version of you, a specific role you played, the one who was always available, the one who never asked for too much, the one who kept the peace, softened the truth, made things comfortable for everyone except themselves. And when you begin to change, not dramatically, but subtly, when you start to need more, want more, speak more honestly, take up more space, those people experience something that feels to them like loss, because the version of you they were comfortable with is beginning to disappear. And rather than grow alongside your growth, they pull away. Sometimes with anger, sometimes with silence, sometimes simply with distance, a slow withdrawal that you may not even fully register until one day you realize they are simply no longer there. This is not failure. This is filtration. The universe is not punishing you for changing. It is protecting the change. It is ensuring that the new version of you is not immediately reabsorbed into the patterns and dynamics that kept the old version in place. Because the single greatest threat to personal transformation is not self-doubt or fear or external circumstance. It is the pull of the familiar, the gravity of who you used to be, reinforced every time you step into the presence of people who only know that version of you. There is a reason why the most profound transformations in human history, the ones that change people at the level of identity and not just behavior, almost always began with a period of isolation and loss. Not because suffering is necessary for growth, but because growth requires space. Real space. The kind of space that cannot be created while you are still surrounded by everything that defined who you used to be. The removal creates the space. The space creates the silence. And the silence, when you stop fighting it and start listening to it, is where the truest version of you begins to speak. You are not being emptied. You are being cleared. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Emptiness is the absence of meaning. Being cleared is the creation of room for meaning that is actually yours. The universe does not remove before it elevates to hurt you. It removes before it elevates because elevation, real elevation, cannot happen in a cluttered life. It requires room. It requires air. It requires the kind of unobstructed inner space that is only available when the things that no longer serve your highest becoming have been gently, firmly, and sometimes painfully moved out of the way. The ones who left without explanation. There is a specific kind of pain that belongs exclusively to the departures that came without warning. The friendships that simply dissolved. The relationships that ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a silence that grew so large it became a wall. The people who were present in your life on a Tuesday, and by the following month, were simply gone, without a reason, without a conversation, without the closure that your heart kept searching for in the days and weeks that followed. These are the departures that haunt, not because they were necessarily the most significant relationships, but because the absence of explanation creates a vacuum that the human mind, by its very nature, is compelled to fill. And what does the mind fill that vacuum with? It fills it with the worst possible interpretation. It fills it with self-blame, with the assumption that something you did, something you are, something fundamentally wrong with you, drove this person away and prevented them from even telling you why. The lack of closure becomes a wound that stays open, not because the relationship itself was irreplaceable, but because the unanswered question becomes a container for every fear you have ever had about your own worthiness. But here is what most people never consider about the people who left without explanation. Sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is leave without saying why. Not because the truth is cruel, not because they are cowards, though sometimes that is also true, but because there are departures that cannot be explained in the language of reasons and conversations, because the truth behind them lives at a level that neither party has the words for. Some connections simply exhaust themselves. Some people feel, at the level of instinct rather than intellect, that they are in the presence of a growth that they cannot match, and they leave not out of malice, but out of a kind of wordless self-preservation. What you were not told, and what no one tells you when you are sitting with the grief of an unexplained exit, is that those departures are often the most deliberate messages the universe delivers, precisely because there is no conversation to soften them, no explanation to give your analytical mind something to hold on to, no closure to let you feel like you have processed and filed and moved on. The absence of explanation forces you into a different kind of processing, one that is less cognitive and more felt. It forces you to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, and to find, within that discomfort, something that does not depend on the other person's words to be true. And what you find, if you are willing to sit with it long enough, is this. The departure was correct, not comfortable, not fair, necessarily, not painless, but correct. It was aligned with something moving in your life that was larger than the connection that ended, and the person who left without explanation was, in their own unconscious, sometimes even unwilling way, participating in the architecture of your becoming. They played their role. The role was complete. And the most efficient exit, the one that left the least room for renegotiation or prolonging what was already finished, was to simply go. This does not mean their departure was not painful. It does not mean you are not allowed to grieve it. It does not mean the wound of being left without words is not real. It is real. But the question worth asking, when the grief has had enough space to breathe, is not, why did they leave without telling me? The question worth asking is what became possible in you because they did. Because every unexplained departure is also an unexplained invitation. An invitation to stop looking for your worth in other people's explanations of you. An invitation to stop needing the people who left to come back and confirm that you were worth something. An invitation to find, in the absence of their words, the beginning of your own voice. The one that does not need permission. The one that does not require validation. The one that knows who you are even when no one else is around to tell you. The ones who left without explanation did not leave you with nothing. They left you with the only thing that was ever truly yours, yourself. Loneliness as the language of transition. You have been told in 1,000 different ways that loneliness is a problem, that it is a symptom of something gone wrong, a signal that you are disconnected, unloved, or somehow failing at the basic human task of belonging. The culture around you treats it like an emergency, something to be solved as quickly as possible, filled with noise, distraction, new connections, anything to avoid sitting in the raw, uncomfortable truth of being alone with yourself. And so you reach for your phone. You scroll. You make plans you do not truly want to make. You fill the silence with anything that is not silence, because silence feels like confirmation of every fear you have about being fundamentally alone in the world. But what if loneliness, the specific kind you are feeling right now, is not a problem at all? What if it is a language? A precise, intentional communication from the part of you that is undergoing transformation, telling you that the old way of filling space no longer works, that the connections you used to reach for have stopped nourishing you, and that something new is being assembled in the interior of who you are, something that requires exactly the conditions that loneliness creates. Throughout human history, every person who underwent a profound and lasting transformation did so in solitude. Not because solitude is romantic or noble in some abstract sense, but because transformation is an internal process, and internal processes cannot be rushed, accelerated, or made more comfortable by the presence of other people. They can only be interrupted by it. The caterpillar does not transform inside a crowd. It seals itself away. It enters a darkness that from the outside looks like death. And in that darkness, without audience, without company, without the noise of the world telling it what it is and what it should become, it dissolves and rebuilds itself into something that did not previously exist. You are in your chrysalis. And what feels like loneliness is actually the sealed walls of your becoming. There is a reason why the quiet is louder than it has ever been. There is a reason why the absence of certain people feels not just like loss but like revelation. Because in the space where they used to be, in the silence where their voices used to fill the room, you are beginning to hear something you have not been able to hear in a very long time. Your own interior voice. The one that has been drowned out by the noise of maintaining connections, managing dynamics, and performing versions of yourself for other people's comfort. That voice is now speaking. And if you are willing to stay with the discomfort of the quiet long enough to actually listen to it, what it is saying will change everything. Loneliness is not the absence of the right people. It is the presence of yourself, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, without the buffer of others between you and the truth of who you are. And that confrontation, while deeply uncomfortable, is the most important one you will ever have. Because you cannot build a life that truly fits you until you know what you actually feel, what you actually want, what you are actually afraid of, and what you actually value when there is no one else in the room whose approval might influence your answers. The people who have walked furthest in their own becoming are not the ones who surrounded themselves with the most. They are the ones who were willing to be alone long enough to become someone worth knowing, who sat in the discomfort of their own company until it was no longer uncomfortable, until it became the most honest and nourishing relationship in their life, the relationship with themselves. What you are experiencing right now is not evidence that you are unloved or unlovable. It is evidence that you are in transition, and transition, by its very nature, requires a kind of in-between space where the old has released and the new has not yet fully arrived. That in-between space feels like loneliness, but it is something else entirely. It is the threshold, and you are standing on it, not because something went wrong, but because something is about to go profoundly, irrevocably right. The mirror they were holding. There is a truth about relationships that most people find deeply uncomfortable, and it is this. The people who affect you the most, the ones whose presence disturbed you, whose absence devastates you, whose behavior confused or wounded you, are almost never doing something entirely unrelated to your own interior world. They are, in some way that is rarely conscious and rarely comfortable, reflecting something back to you, something you have not yet been willing to look at directly, something that lives in the unexamined corridors of your own psychology, dressed up in their face, amplified in their behavior, made impossible to ignore through the intensity of your reaction to them. This is what psychologists refer to as projection and mirroring, and while the clinical language makes it sound abstract, the lived experience of it is extraordinarily intimate. The friend who made you feel invisible was reflecting your own belief that you do not deserve to be fully seen. The partner who never fully committed was reflecting your own unexamined fear of what would happen if someone actually stayed. The person whose harshness wounded you was reflecting the voice you already use on yourself in the privacy of your own mind, just externalized, made louder, made impossible to pretend you could not hear. Most people, when they lose a significant relationship, spend their grief focused entirely on the other person, what they did, who they were, what they meant. And while that grief is real and valid and deserving of space, it is also incomplete. Because the question that carries the most transformative potential is not who were they to me, but what were they showing me about myself? What did their presence in my life illuminate that I had been unable or unwilling to see before? And what does their removal now create the conditions for me to finally face? Think about the relationship that has caused you the most pain, not necessarily the most dramatic, but the one that reached deepest, the one that left a mark that did not fully fade. Now ask yourself, honestly, what did that person consistently trigger in you? Not what did they do wrong, but what did their behavior touch inside you that already existed before they arrived? Because here is the thing that changes everything when you truly understand it. You cannot be wounded in a place that is not already wounded. The people who hurt us most are almost always pressing on bruises that were formed long before they appeared. This is not about excusing harmful behavior. This is not about making the person who hurt you blameless by turning everything inward. It is about recognizing that your intensity of reaction, the reason this particular person got to you in the way they did, was not random. It was specific. It was surgical. They found the exact tender places because those tender places were there, waiting to be found, waiting to be healed, waiting for someone or something to make them impossible to ignore any longer. When the people who held your mirror are removed, the mirror disappears with them. And what you are left with is the direct experience of what they were reflecting, no longer filtered through their presence, no longer explained away by the drama of the relationship. You are left with yourself, with the raw material of your own patterns, your own fears, your own unhealed places, made visible now not through someone else but through the quality of your own thoughts, your own choices, your own relationship with silence. This is the gift hidden inside the grief of removal. Not the gift of having them gone, but the gift of finally being able to see what they were pointing toward. The gift of being given, perhaps for the first time, the unmediated opportunity to choose differently, to respond to yourself the way you always wanted them to respond to you, to offer yourself the seeing, the acceptance, the gentleness that you spent years trying to draw out of someone who could not give it. Because no one can give from the outside what you have not yet found on the inside. The people who left were holding your mirror. Now it is yours. When you outgrow someone you still love, there is a category of loss that does not have an adequate name. And because it does not have a name, most people do not know how to grieve it properly. It is the loss that happens not because someone wronged you, not because the relationship became toxic or painful or untenable, but simply because you grew. Because the person you were becoming required more room than the connection could provide. Because the direction of your life began to move in a way that the other person's life was not moving. And the distance between your two paths became, over time, too significant to bridge without one of you abandoning something essential about who you were becoming. This is the most quietly devastating form of removal, because it offers none of the psychological relief that comes with other endings. When someone hurts you, when a relationship becomes visibly damaging, there is a story you can tell yourself that makes the ending feel necessary, that makes the pain make sense. But when you lose someone you still love, someone who is not wrong, someone who has done nothing to deserve losing you, someone who is simply not growing in the same direction, the grief has nowhere clean to land. You cannot be angry at them. You cannot make them the villain. You cannot even fully explain, to yourself or to anyone else, why this had to end, and so the grief becomes tangled. It becomes confused with guilt, with the persistent, nagging question of whether you made the right choice, whether you should have stayed, whether the growth you pursued was worth the cost of the connection you lost. It becomes entangled with a kind of mourning that is not just for the person, but for the version of yourself that existed when they were in your life. The self that fit in that particular world, that belonged in that particular circle, that could walk through that particular door without having to leave something of who you are becoming outside. But here is what is true, even when it is painful to acknowledge. Love and alignment are not the same thing. You can love someone completely, genuinely, deeply, and still know that staying in their life at the cost of your own becoming is not love. It is self-abandonment, dressed in the language of loyalty. True love for another person includes the willingness to release them when holding on requires either of you to stop growing. And true self-respect includes the willingness to acknowledge, when a connection, no matter how warm, has reached the ceiling of what it can hold. Growth is not betrayal. Changing is not abandonment. Becoming someone new is not a rejection of who you were with them or what you shared. It is simply the honest movement of a life that is alive, that is responding to its own becoming, that refuses to stay small in order to stay comfortable. And the people who truly loved you, even the ones who could not grow alongside you, understood this at some level, even if the understanding lived somewhere beneath the grief of watching you go. There is something else worth sitting with. The love does not have to end when the relationship does. The connection does not have to be erased from the record of what mattered. The years you spent with someone who could not make the journey with you were not wasted. They were part of the path. They built something in you. They gave you something that you carried forward, even into the version of yourself that no longer fits inside the world you shared with them. Outgrowing someone you love is one of the most honest and courageous things a human being can do. It requires you to choose your own becoming over the comfort of the familiar. It requires you to hold two things at once, the love and the leaving, the gratitude and the grief, the knowledge that this person mattered and the knowledge that their chapter in your story is complete. It requires a kind of emotional complexity that most people are never taught how to hold, but the capacity to hold it, to grieve fully and still move forward, to release what cannot come with you without releasing the love you feel for it. That capacity is itself evidence of how much you have already grown. And the next chapter of your life will only be possible because you were brave enough to take it without everyone you loved by your side. The invisible agreements your soul made, long before you had language for it, long before you had the intellectual framework to understand what was happening to you. Your life was already in motion, not randomly, not chaotically, but with a specific direction, a specific curriculum, a set of experiences and relationships that were, in some way that defies easy explanation, exactly what your soul needed in order to learn what it came here to learn. This idea makes some people uncomfortable because it implies a kind of design, a kind of intention at work beneath the surface of what we experience as ordinary, often painful human life. But sit with it for a moment, not as a belief you are required to adopt, but as a lens through which to examine what has actually happened to you. The people who entered your life at significant moments, the connections that formed with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the time you had actually known each other, the relationships that felt, from the very beginning, like something you recognized, something you had been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. And then, the endings. The way certain relationships concluded with such completeness, such finality, that even in the grief of them you could sense, somewhere beneath the surface, that something had been resolved, something had been delivered, something had arrived at its natural conclusion, not prematurely, but exactly on time. What if the people in your life were not random? What if the connections you formed, the ones that shaped you most profoundly, were in some sense chosen, not by the conscious planning mind, but at a level of self that operates on a longer timeline, that understands what you need in a way your everyday awareness cannot access? What if some of the people you loved were teachers you chose before you knew you needed the lesson? What if the pain they caused you was not random cruelty, but the specific friction required to develop something in you that could not have been developed any other way? This is not about absolving people of responsibility for their behavior. It is not about deciding that harm was therefore acceptable because it served a purpose. It is about recognizing that your deepest growth did not come from your most comfortable experiences. It came from your most challenging ones, from the relationships that pushed you into territory you would never have chosen to enter voluntarily, from the losses that forced you to develop capacities you did not know you had, from the people who, in their very inability to give you what you needed, taught you what you were capable of giving yourself. Every connection in your life had an expiration date, not because people are disposable, but because the agreement, if we can call it that, was always specific. It was always bounded. Certain people entered your life to show you what love could feel like, so that you would never again settle for its absence. Certain people entered to show you what you were capable of surviving, so that you would know, from direct experience, how resilient you actually are. Certain people entered to mirror your own unhealed places, to press on the wounds with enough consistency that you finally could not ignore them. And when the delivery was complete, the agreement was fulfilled, and the most natural thing, the most aligned thing, was for the connection to end. This reframe does not make the grief disappear, but it does something more important. It gives the grief a different quality. Instead of the open, directionless ache of feeling abandoned or unloved or discarded, it becomes something more like the bittersweet feeling of completion, of something that ran its full course, of a chapter that was written exactly as long as it needed to be, not cut short, not extended past its natural ending, but concluded with exactly the precision that the story required. The people who are no longer in your life fulfilled their agreement with you. They gave you what they came to give. And the fact that you are still here, still standing, still in the process of becoming, is evidence that you received it. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Signs you are being prepared, not punished. There comes a point in every profound transformation when the person in the middle of it has a choice. They can look at everything that is changing, everything that is falling away, everything that feels uncertain and unsteady and frighteningly new, and conclude that something is going wrong, that they are being punished, that life is moving against them, stripping away the things they need, leaving them exposed and unprepared for whatever is coming next. Or they can learn to read the signs differently, to recognize, in the disorientation of transition, the specific and unmistakable fingerprints of preparation, because there is a difference between the chaos of things falling apart and the order of things being rearranged. And once you know what to look for, you can feel that difference even when it is difficult to articulate it to someone who has not felt it themselves. The first sign is clarity. Not the loud, dramatic kind of clarity that arrives in moments of inspiration, but the quiet, persistent kind that begins to surface when the noise reduces. When you are no longer spending your energy managing the dynamics of relationships that were never truly aligned, you suddenly have access to thoughts and insights and perspectives that were always yours, but were previously inaccessible beneath the weight of everything you were maintaining. If you have been experiencing unexpected moments of clarity recently, sudden knowing about what you want and what you do not want, surprising certainty in spaces where you used to feel confused, that is not coincidental. That is what happens when the noise decreases enough for you to hear yourself. The second sign is the falling away of old patterns. Habits, behaviors, and ways of responding that you have had for years suddenly begin to feel wrong. They no longer fit. You reach for the old coping mechanism and find that it does not deliver what it used to. You try to return to a familiar dynamic and find that you cannot. Something in you has shifted at a level deep enough that the old patterns cannot find purchase. This can feel disorienting, even destabilizing. But it is one of the clearest signs that a genuine transformation is underway. Not a surface-level change, but a structural one. The third sign is an inexplicable pull, a direction, an interest, a sense of possibility that you cannot fully justify intellectually but that feels, at the level of instinct, more right than anything you have felt in a long time. This pull is not about logic. It does not come with a detailed plan or a guaranteed outcome. It comes as a feeling, a leaning, a persistent whisper that becomes harder and harder to ignore the quieter your life becomes. If you are experiencing this pull right now, toward something new, something that the old version of you would have dismissed as unrealistic or impractical, pay attention to it. It is not random desire. It is direction. The fourth sign is that time alone no longer feels like punishment. If you have noticed a shift in your relationship with solitude, a growing ability to sit with yourself without reaching for distraction, a surprising comfort in the quiet that used to feel unbearable, this is significant. Because the ability to be alone without being lonely is one of the hallmarks of a self that has found its own center. It is the sign of an identity that no longer depends entirely on external validation to feel real. The fifth sign, and perhaps the most important, is the specific feeling that something is coming. Not in an anxious, dreadful way, but in the way you feel the air change before a storm breaks. A sense of threshold, of being on the edge of something, of a door that has not yet opened but that you can feel on the other side of the wall. If you feel this, do not dismiss it. It is not wishful thinking. It is perception. You are picking up on the movement of your own life in a direction that your conscious mind has not yet fully mapped. You are being prepared. Everything that has felt like loss has been clearing the way. Everything that has felt like punishment has been precision. And the life that is being assembled for you, the one that fits who you actually are, rather than who you learned to perform, is closer than it has ever been. Becoming someone new costs. Someone old. Nobody warns you about this part. They talk about growth and transformation and becoming your best self as though it is an additive process, as though you simply acquire new qualities and new capacities and layer them on top of who you already were. But that is not what actually happens. What actually happens is fundamentally different and in many ways far more difficult than the inspiring version of the story suggests. Becoming someone new requires the death of someone old, not dramatically, not literally, but in every way that matters psychologically and spiritually. The beliefs that organized your old identity have to be released. The self-image that you protected and defended and built an entire life around has to soften, has to be questioned, has to be allowed to dissolve. The roles you played, the patterns you lived out, the ways of relating that felt like simply who you were rather than choices you were making, all of it has to be examined, held up to the light. Kept if it still serves. Released if it does not. This is not comfortable work. It is the work of a lifetime, and it has a cost that most discussions of personal growth prefer not to emphasize. The cost is the people who knew the old you, the ones whose relationship with you was built on the specific version of yourself that is now in the process of being released. Because here is the difficult truth. You cannot fully become someone new while also maintaining the complete social world that was built around who you used to be. Not because people are incapable of accepting growth, but because the dynamic between you and certain people is itself a kind of structure. And structures that are built around a specific shape will crack when the shape begins to change. Think about how you presented yourself in your most significant relationships, the role you played, the needs you suppressed, the aspects of yourself you did not show, not because you were being deliberately dishonest, but because in that particular dynamic, with that particular person, those aspects of yourself simply did not have permission to exist. Now think about what happens to that dynamic when those aspects begin to emerge. When you start saying the thing you always left unsaid. When you start needing what you always pretended not to need. When you start taking up the space you always quietly contracted to avoid taking. Some people will celebrate that. Some will be genuinely glad to meet more of you. But others will react with confusion, discomfort, or quiet withdrawal. Not because they are bad people, but because the version of you they are encountering no longer matches the internal model they had built of who you are. And that mismatch is disorienting. It challenges their understanding not just of you, but of themselves. Because your willingness to change asks, implicitly, whether they are willing to do the same. And for some people, the answer to that question is not one they are ready to give. The relationships that cannot survive your becoming were relationships built on the old you's presence in them. And the old you, the one who stayed small, who kept quiet, who managed and performed and adjusted, is no longer available, not because you abandoned them, but because that version of you is in the process of becoming something it was always meant to become. And the transformation is not negotiable. Because the cost of not transforming, the cost of staying who you were to maintain the comfort of the old connections, is a cost you have already stopped being willing to pay. Grieving the old self is real work. It deserves to be honored. The person you were, the one who survived everything that happened before this moment, who built the coping mechanisms and the patterns and the ways of being that got you here, deserves to be honored before being released. Not as a failure, not as someone to be ashamed of, but as the necessary, essential, courageous version of yourself that carried you to the threshold of who you are becoming. Becoming someone new costs someone old. That price is real, and it is worth every cent. What the empty space is actually for, after the people leave, after the circle thins, after the noise dies down and the calendar clears, and you find yourself in possession of more solitude and more silence than you have known in years. After all of that, there is a moment that almost everyone faces and almost everyone handles in exactly the wrong way. The moment of the empty space. The empty space is terrifying, not because it is actually dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar, and the human nervous system is designed to interpret unfamiliar as unsafe. And so the instinct, the overwhelming, almost irresistible instinct, is to fill it. To reach for something, anything, that will make the emptiness feel less empty. To scroll until the hours disappear. To manufacture busyness that has no real direction, but at least provides the sensation of movement. To seek out new connections before the old ones have finished teaching you what they came to teach. To replace the noise with different noise rather than learning what the silence is saying. But the empty space is not a problem. The empty space is a technology. In physics, there is a principle that most people find counterintuitive. A vacuum does not remain empty. The moment true emptiness is created, the laws of nature immediately begin filling it with something new. The vacuum is not a permanent state. It is a transition state, a temporary condition that exists precisely so that it can be filled with what comes next. And what comes next is always determined by what was cleared to create the space in the first place. The same principle operates in your life. The emptiness left by the people and dynamics and connections that have been removed is not permanent emptiness. It is the active condition required for something new to arrive, something that could not have entered while the old occupants were still in place, something that is, even now, being drawn toward the space you have cleared, following the same invisible laws that govern every other form of movement in the universe. But here's the crucial part. What fills the vacuum is determined by what you do with the space while it is empty. If you fill it with distraction, with noise, with premature new connections that are built on the same old patterns, you recreate the same kind of world you had before. The new simply replicates the old, and the whole painful clearing process has to happen again, at greater cost, at a later date. But if you stay with the emptiness long enough to understand it, if you bring genuine attention and honesty into the space that has been created, if you use the quiet to get deeply honest about what you actually want to call into your life next, then what fills the space will be different. It will be aligned. It will fit the person you are becoming rather than the person you used to be. The empty space is for you. It is your time, not in the superficial sense of rest or leisure, though those are part of it. It is your time in the most fundamental sense. Time to listen to what you actually want, without the noise of other people's needs and expectations drowning it out. Time to feel what you actually feel without the performance of feeling the right thing for the right audience. Time to think thoughts that are entirely yours, that have not been shaped by the gravitational pull of other people's worldviews. Time to find out who you actually are when there is no one left to perform for. The empty space is the most fertile ground you will ever stand on, not because it contains something already, but because it contains everything that is possible. And what you plant in it, with intention, with honesty, with the hard-won clarity of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of their own company, will grow into the life that has been waiting for you all along. Do not fill the space. Inhabit it, because what is built in genuine emptiness, what rises from a foundation of true self-knowledge, is the only thing that was ever worth building. You were never abandoned. You were chosen. Finally, you are here. Not at the end of something, but at the beginning. And it took everything. Every departure, every silence, every night of wondering why and whether you would ever understand, to arrive at this exact moment, with the clarity to hear what has been true all along. You were never abandoned. Not by life. Not by the universe. Not by the deeper intelligence that has been moving through every chapter of your story, orchestrating the removals and the silences and the long, disorienting spaces of becoming with a precision that your grief could not allow you to recognize while you were inside it. You were never left. You were led away from what was keeping you small, led through the necessary discomfort of releasing what no longer belonged to who you were always meant to become, led with more care than you know how to measure, toward the version of your life that actually fits the fullness of who you are. Every person who left, every friendship that dissolved, every relationship that reached its natural ceiling, every unexpected departure that came without explanation or closure or the goodbye you deserved. Every one of them was not evidence of your unworthiness. It was evidence of your readiness, evidence that you had received what that connection had come to give, evidence that the curriculum of your soul had moved forward, had demanded a new chapter, had outgrown the classroom it had been learning in and required a larger room, a wider sky, a more expansive version of reality than the one those connections could provide. The universe does not remove randomly. It removes with intention, and the intention is always the same, to create the conditions for your fullest possible life. Not the life that is most comfortable, not the life that is most familiar, not the life that is most easily explained to the people who knew you before, but the life that is most fully, most courageously, most authentically yours. The life that requires you to be all of who you are, not the edited version, not the performed version, not the version designed to be palatable to people who could not handle your full presence, but the real version, the one that has been waiting beneath all the adaptation and the management and the quiet self-erasure, for a moment exactly like this one to finally breathe. You have been in a process, a profound, painful, irreversible process of becoming, and every element of that process, including and especially the parts that felt like failure, the parts that felt like abandonment, the parts that left you lying awake at night wondering what was wrong with you and when the hurting would stop, every single element was working in your favor, was building something in you, was developing capacities you would not have developed in any other way, was forging the specific, irreplaceable version of you that this particular moment in your life requires. The people who are meant to walk forward with you are not lost. They have not already passed you by. The connections that are aligned with who you are becoming, not who you were, not the edited version, but the full, uncompromised, finally free version of yourself. Those connections are drawn to the you that is being born out of everything you have survived. You do not need to find them. You need to become the person who can receive them. And that is precisely what has been happening in the long, uncomfortable, profoundly necessary quiet of your becoming. This is not the moment to look back, not with longing, not with regret, not with the wish that things had gone differently. They went exactly as they needed to go. The people left at exactly the right time. The spaces opened exactly when they were supposed to. The silence arrived precisely when you needed to hear what only silence could carry. And you are here, standing in the fullness of everything you survived and everything you released, with more room inside you than you have ever had, with more honesty, more clarity, more access to your own truth than at any previous point in your life. The life that begins now is not the life you planned. It is better than the life you planned. It is the life that was always being built for you in the invisible spaces behind what you could see, assembled from every lesson you integrated, every wound you chose to understand rather than repeat, every moment you stayed with the discomfort instead of running from it, every departure you grieved fully enough to actually move through. You were never abandoned. You were never forgotten. You were never left behind by anything that truly mattered. You were chosen for a life that required everything you went through to prepare you for it. Chosen for a depth of experience that most people never reach because they were never willing to lose what you lost. Chosen for a version of yourself that the people who left could never have known because it was not yet born while they were with you. It is born now, and the only thing left to do is walk into the life that has been waiting, with every step grounded in the unshakable knowledge of who you are, who you have become, and who you have always, beneath everything, been. This is not the end of your story. It is the first page of the real one.